I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Deborah Winters standing at my front door with that pinched expression she always wore, like she had just bitten into a lemon wrapped in bureaucracy. My name is Keith Norton, and I have lived in the Pinewood Hills subdivision in Boulder, Colorado for 3 years now. It is a decent neighborhood with well-maintained lawns, friendly neighbors, and unfortunately, an HOA president who thought she was running a small dictatorship rather than a homeowners association. Deborah was in her mid-50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of pastel cardigans and khaki pants. She carried a leather-bound folder everywhere she went, which I assumed contained every single HOA rule ever written, highlighted and cross-referenced. "Keith," she said, not bothering with a greeting, "we need to discuss your flagrant violation of Section 12, subsection C of the HOA covenant." I had been loading groceries from my truck, and I set down the bags slowly, already feeling my blood pressure rise. "Good afternoon to you too, Deborah. What violation are you talking about?" She opened her folder with theatrical precision and pointed to a spot on the page. "Your propane tanks. They are stored on the side of your house, visible from the street. This is a direct violation of our aesthetic guidelines." I looked over at the two 20-pound propane tanks sitting neatly against the brick exterior of my house. They were for my grill, which I used regularly during Colorado's beautiful summer months. The tanks were not an eyesore by any stretch of the imagination. They were clean, properly stored, and barely visible unless you were specifically looking for them. "Deborah, those are just propane tanks for my grill. Every house on this block has a grill, and most people keep their propane tanks exactly where mine are." "Not anymore," she said, snapping the folder shut. "The HOA board held an emergency meeting last week, and we voted to update the covenants. All propane tanks, gas canisters, and similar items must be stored completely out of sight. That means in your garage or behind a privacy fence at minimum 6 feet high." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "My garage is full, Deborah. I have my workshop in there, and there is no room for propane tanks. And I am not building a 6-foot privacy fence just to hide 2 small tanks." "Then you will need to find alternative arrangements," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made my teeth grind. "You have 72 hours to comply, or you will be fined $50 per day until the violation is corrected." "This is ridiculous," I said, feeling my frustration mount. "Those tanks are not hurting anyone. They are safe, they are clean, and they are necessary for me to use my grill." Deborah straightened her shoulders, looking down her nose at me despite being 3 inches shorter. "The rules exist for a reason, Keith. Property values depend on maintaining certain standards. If we let everyone store unsightly items wherever they please, this neighborhood would become a mess. The fine starts in 72 hours. I suggest you comply." She turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway, leaving me standing there with my groceries and a mounting sense of injustice. I watched her get into her pristine white sedan and drive away, probably heading to harass some other poor neighbor about their mailbox placement or lawn ornaments. Over the next few days, I looked into my options. I talked to my neighbor, Rick, who lived 3 houses down. He was a retired firefighter with a practical attitude and no patience for HOA nonsense. "Yeah, she hit me with the same thing," Rick told me as we stood in his driveway. "I ended up moving my tanks into my shed. It is a pain in the rear end because now I have to haul them back and forth every time I want to grill, but I did not want to deal with the fines." "This is insane," I said. "When did the HOA become so controlling?" Rick shrugged. "Ever since Deborah became president 2 years ago." She has been on a power trip. Last year, she tried to mandate what color flowers people could plant in their front yards. That one did not pass, but she keeps pushing more and more restrictions. I went home and tried to figure out a solution. My garage really was full. I had a complete woodworking setup in there, including a table saw, drill press, and lumber storage. It was my hobby and my sanctuary. The idea of dismantling my workspace just to store 2 propane tanks seemed absurd. I considered building a small storage box, but even that would need to comply with HOA regulations, which meant submitting plans, waiting for approval, and probably getting rejected for some arbitrary reason. The 72 hours passed, and sure enough, I received a formal violation notice in the mail. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead and detailed my violation, the fine structure, and a stern warning about the importance of compliance. I was now being charged $50 per day. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to contest the rule. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was mostly used for holiday parties and garage sale organizing events. When I arrived, about 15 other homeowners were already there, sitting in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where Deborah and her board members sat. Deborah called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, which seemed unnecessarily dramatic for a neighborhood meeting. We will now open the floor for homeowner comments. Please keep your remarks brief and respectful. I raised my hand, and she acknowledged me with a tight smile. Keith Norton, I assume you are here to discuss your ongoing violation. I am here to discuss the new propane tank rule, I said, standing up. I think it is unreasonable and unnecessary. Propane tanks are a normal part of outdoor cooking, and requiring people to hide them or build expensive storage solutions is excessive. The board has made its decision, Deborah said. The rule is in place to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. But there is no evidence that visible propane tanks hurt property values, I countered. I looked into it. There is no correlation between propane tank visibility and home sale prices. This is just a personal preference being forced on everyone. A few other homeowners murmured in agreement. I noticed Rick nodding from his seat. Deborah's expression hardened. The board has the authority to establish and enforce community standards. If you do not like the rules, you are free to move to a neighborhood without an HOA. That is not a solution, I said, feeling my anger rise. I bought my home here. I should not have to move just because the HOA decided to implement arbitrary rules. Your comments are noted, Deborah said dismissively. Next item on the agenda. I sat down, fuming. The rest of the meeting covered mundane topics like landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. When it ended, several homeowners came up to me and expressed their frustration with the board's increasingly restrictive rules, but no one seemed willing to challenge Deborah directly. Over the next week, I racked up $350 in fines. I finally, reluctantly, moved my propane tanks into my garage. It meant rearranging my entire workspace, shoving my lumber rack into a corner and making it much harder to access my tools. Every time I wanted to grill, I had to navigate around equipment and haul the heavy tanks outside. It was inconvenient and frustrating, but I could not afford to keep paying fines indefinitely. Summer turned into fall, and I tried to put the whole propane tank debacle behind me. I focused on my work as a software developer and spent my weekends working on projects in my cramped garage. Deborah continued her reign over the HOA with an iron fist, sending out violation notices for everything from slightly overgrown grass to trash, cans left out an hour too long after pickup. Then November arrived, and with it came an early cold snap. Colorado winters could be brutal, and this one started with a vengeance. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and a major snowstorm was forecast for the weekend. I made sure I was prepared, stocking up on groceries, firewood for my fireplace, and checking that my generator was in good working order. Living in Colorado, you learn to be ready for winter emergencies. On Friday evening, the snow started falling. By Saturday morning, we had 18 inches on the ground and more coming down. The power flickered a few times but held. I spent the day inside, working on a chair I was building in my garage and occasionally checking the news for weather updates. Around 4 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang. I was surprised because the roads were nearly impassable, and most people were staying home. When I opened the door, I found Deborah standing on my porch, looking decidedly less composed than usual. Her hair was covered in snow, her face was red from the cold, and she looked almost desperate. "Keith," she said, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone, "I need to ask you a favor." I leaned against the doorframe, curious. "What kind of favor?" "My furnace went out," she said, and I could see she was shivering. "The pilot light will not stay lit. I called my heating company, but they are completely overwhelmed with emergency calls. They cannot get to me until Monday at the earliest." "That is rough," I said, genuinely sympathetic despite my feelings about her. "Do you have any alternative heat sources?" "That is why I am here," she said, and I could see how much it pained her to ask. "I have a propane heater, but I am out of propane. I went to 3 different stores today before the roads got too bad and everyone is sold out. I know you keep propane tanks for your grill. I was hoping I could buy one from you. I will pay whatever you want." I stood there for a moment, processing this. The woman who had fined me hundreds of dollars for storing propane tanks visibly, who had made my life difficult over something so trivial, was now standing on my porch in a snowstorm asking to buy propane from me. The irony was almost too perfect. "So you want to buy propane from me," I said slowly. "The propane I had to move because of the rule you implemented." Deborah's face flushed deeper, though whether from cold or embarrassment I could not tell. "Yes, I know this is awkward given our history, but I am really in a bind here. My house is already down to 58 degrees, and it is supposed to get below 0 tonight." I considered my options. Part of me wanted to turn her away, to let her experience the consequences of her own authoritarian approach to the HOA. But I was not that kind of person, and leaving someone in the cold, literally, during a dangerous winter storm was not something I could do in good conscience. "Come in out of the snow," I said, stepping aside. "Let me think about this for a minute." She hesitated, then stepped into my entryway, careful to stay on the mat and not track snow through my house. She looked around, and I could see her taking in the details of my home, probably cataloging potential violations even in her moment of need. "How big is your propane heater?" I asked. "It is a standard indoor safe model," she said. "It takes the same 1-pound propane cylinders that camping stoves use, but I have an adapter hose that lets me connect it to a 20-pound tank." I nodded. I had 2 20-pound tanks, both full. I had refilled them at the end of grilling season specifically so they would be ready for next spring. Giving one to Deborah would not leave me without, but it would mean having to go get another one refilled once the weather cleared and the stores were stocked. "I will sell you 1 tank," I said. "But there are conditions." Her expression became wary. "What conditions?" "First, you are going to pay me fair market value for the propane plus a delivery fee since I am bringing it to you. That comes to $100. She nodded quickly. "That is fine." "Second," I continued, "you are going to formally acknowledge that the propane tank storage rule is unreasonable. I want it in writing. Her face tightened. Keith, I cannot just unilaterally change HOA rules. I am not asking you to change it right now, I said. I am asking you to acknowledge in writing that it is unreasonable. You can call an emergency board meeting once the weather clears and propose revoking it. And if I refuse, she asked. I shrugged. Then you can try your luck finding propane somewhere else. I hear the hardware store might get a shipment on Tuesday, assuming the roads are clear by then. Deborah stood there, dripping melted snow onto my mat, clearly wrestling with her pride. She was cold, desperate, and out of options. I could see the internal battle playing out on her face. Fine, she finally said. I will write it down, but I cannot guarantee the board will vote to revoke the rule. That is all I am asking, I said. An acknowledgement and a good faith effort. I went to my office and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, then brought them to her. She took them with shaking hands. Whether from cold or anger, I was not sure, and wrote out a brief statement acknowledging that the propane tank storage rule was unreasonably restrictive, and that she would propose its revocation at the next board meeting. She signed and dated it. I read it over, then folded it and put it in my pocket. Wait here. I will get you the propane tank. I went through the house to the garage, navigating around my displaced woodworking equipment to where I had stashed my propane tanks. I grabbed one, checked that it was full, and carried it back through the house. Deborah was still standing on the mat, looking miserable and cold. Here you go, I said, handing her the tank. Do you need help getting it to your car? I walked, she said quietly. I only lived 2 streets over, and I did not want to risk getting my car stuck. I sighed. Of course she had walked in a blizzard. Give me a minute to put on my boots and coat. I will help you carry it. You do not have to do that, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. It is 20 pounds of awkward metal cylinder, and the snow is 18 inches deep. Yes, I do. I bundled up in my winter gear, and we headed out into the storm. The wind had picked up and visibility was poor. We trudged through the snow, me carrying the propane tank, Deborah struggling to keep up. Her house was on Maple Drive, a short distance away but made much longer by the conditions. By the time we arrived at her door, we were both covered in snow and breathing hard. Deborah's house was a pristine 2-story colonial with pale blue siding and white trim. Even in the snowstorm, I could see that her lawn was perfectly maintained and her landscaping was magazine-worthy. We went inside, and I helped her get the propane heater set up. It was a substantial unit, designed for indoor use with proper ventilation and safety features. I connected the tank, checked for leaks, and got it running. Make sure you crack a window for ventilation, I told her. Even indoor safe heaters produce some carbon monoxide. You do not want to risk it, especially if you are running it overnight. I know, she said, but I noticed her going to open a window slightly anyway. The heater started pushing out warm air, and the relief on her face was obvious. Thank you, she said, and for the first time since I had known her, she sounded genuinely humble. I really appreciate this. I know I have not been easy to deal with regarding the HOA issues. No, you have not, I agreed, but nobody deserves to freeze in their own home. Just remember what you wrote, and let us see if we can fix this stupid rule once and for all. I left her there and made my way back home through the worsening storm. The walk back was harder, fighting against the wind, and I was exhausted by the time I got inside. I stripped off my wet gear and made myself a cup of hot coffee, thinking about the bizarre turn of events. The storm continued through Sunday, dumping another foot of snow before finally moving on. The power stayed on, thankfully, though I heard from Rick that some parts of the neighborhood had lost electricity. By Monday morning, the sun was out, and city plows were working to clear the streets. Everything was buried under more than 2 feet of snow, transformed into a winter wonderland that was beautiful but paralyzing. I spent Monday digging out my driveway and truck. It was hard work, and I was grateful for the exercise after being cooped up all weekend. Rick came by with his snowblower and helped me finish up, and I helped him clear his driveway in return. We talked about the storm and the neighborhood, and I mentioned that I had sold a propane tank to Deborah. "You are kidding," Rick said, laughing. "The woman who banned visible propane tanks came begging for propane during the storm. She was desperate," I said. "Her furnace died and she had no other options." "Still, that is some cosmic justice right there. Did you charge her extra, $100 for the tank and delivery?" I said. "And I made her write a statement acknowledging the rule was unreasonable." Rick's eyes widened. "Seriously, you think she will actually follow through?" "I guess we will find out," I said. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal. The roads cleared, people went back to work, and the neighborhood resumed its usual rhythm. I did not hear from Deborah, but I did not expect to immediately. I figured she was dealing with her furnace repair and probably dreading the moment when she would have to face the board about her written promise. 2 weeks later, I received a notice in the mail about an emergency HOA board meeting. The agenda listed only one item: review and potential revision of Section 12, subsection C regarding propane tank storage. I was surprised that Deborah was actually following through, though I suppose she valued her word enough to honor her commitment, even if it killed her pride. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening, and the community center was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Word had apparently spread about what was being discussed, and many homeowners showed up, either curious or eager to see the strict propane rule potentially overturned. Rick came with me and we found seats near the front. Deborah sat at the board table with the 4 other board members: Patricia, Gerald, Huang, and Margaret. They all looked uncomfortable, and I could tell there had been discussions before the public meeting. Deborah looked particularly stiff, her expression carefully neutral. She called the meeting to order and got straight to the point. "We are here tonight to discuss the propane tank storage restriction that was implemented in August of last year. It has come to the board's attention that this rule may be overly restrictive and impractical for many homeowners. I am proposing that we revoke the rule and return to the previous standard, which allowed propane tanks to be stored on residential property, provided they meet safety requirements and are not blatantly visible from the street." There was immediate murmuring among the attendees. Patricia, one of the other board members, spoke up. "Deborah, can you explain what prompted this change of position? You were quite adamant about this rule when we originally passed it." Deborah's jaw tightened. "I have come to realize, through personal experience, that the rule created unnecessary hardship for homeowners without providing meaningful benefit to the community. The original intent was to maintain aesthetic standards, but the practical reality is that propane tanks are a normal and necessary part of many households. Requiring people to completely hide them or face ongoing fines is disproportionate." I caught her eye across the room and she quickly looked away. I could tell this was difficult for her, admitting she had been wrong in front of the entire community. Gerald, an older man who had been on the board longer than Deborah, nodded thoughtfully. "I voted against the original rule because I thought it was too strict. I would support reverting to the previous standard." "I agree," said Huang. "The rule has generated more complaints than any other policy we have implemented in the past 5 years. I think we overreached." Margaret, however, looked less convinced. "If we just revoke it, are we not setting a precedent that any rule can be challenged and overturned if people complain enough? What about maintaining board authority?" Maintaining authority is not the same as being inflexible, I said, standing up. A good board listens to its community and corrects mistakes. This rule was a mistake, and everyone knows it. Revoking it is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of good judgment. There was a round of applause from the assembled homeowners. Margaret still looked skeptical, but I could see she was outnumbered. Deborah called for a vote. Gerald and Huang voted immediately to revoke the rule. Patricia hesitated, then voted in favor. Margaret voted against. Deborah, as president, cast the deciding vote in favor of revocation. The propane tank storage rule was officially eliminated. The room erupted in applause and conversation. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, knowing I could move my propane tanks back outside and reclaim my garage workspace. More than that, it felt like a small victory for common sense over arbitrary authority. After the meeting ended, people milled around chatting. Several homeowners came up to thank me for speaking out. Rick clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. "You actually did it, man. You got the rule changed." "Deborah did it," I corrected. "She kept her word, even though it cost her." I looked over and saw Deborah packing up her materials at the board table. She looked tired and defeated, and I felt a twinge of sympathy. For all her faults, she had followed through on her promise. That took integrity, even if it was integrity born from desperation. I walked over to her as the room cleared out. "Thank you for keeping your word." She looked up at me, her expression guarded. "I said I would, and I did. I do not go back on commitments, Keith, even when they are uncomfortable." "I respect that," I said. "For what it is worth, I think what you did tonight took courage. Admitting you were wrong in front of everyone, that is not easy." She let out a long breath. "No, it is not, but you were right." The rule was unreasonable, and I was so focused on maintaining standards that I lost sight of what was practical. I let my desire for control override common sense. "Are you doing okay with your furnace?" I asked, changing the subject to safer ground. "It is fixed," she said. The repair company finally got to me on Tuesday. It cost me $800, but at least I have heat again. That propane heater you sold me kept my pipes from freezing and probably saved me from thousands in damage. "I am glad it worked out," I said. There was an awkward pause, then Deborah said, "I owe you an apology. Not just about the propane tank rule, but about my approach to the HOA in general. I have been too rigid, too controlling. I thought I was protecting property values and community standards, but really, I was just imposing my preferences on everyone else. Several people have told me as much tonight, quite bluntly." I nodded. HOAs can serve a purpose, but they work best when they are focused on genuinely important issues, not micromanaging every detail of people's lives. "Deborah, most people in this neighborhood just want to live peacefully without constantly worrying about violation notices." "I understand that now," she said quietly. "I am going to try to be better, less authoritarian, more collaborative. We will see if I can manage it." "It is worth trying," I said. "Good luck." I left the community center feeling satisfied. The drive home was short, and when I pulled into my driveway, I looked at the side of my house where my propane tanks used to sit. Tomorrow, I would move them back out of the garage and reclaim my workspace. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of life, but it mattered. It was about principle, about standing up against unreasonable restrictions, and about the community finding its voice. The next morning, I moved my propane tanks back outside. It took me an hour to rearrange my garage, putting everything back where it belonged. When I was finished, I stood in my workshop and felt a sense of rightness return. This was my space, organized the way I wanted it, functional and efficient. I could breathe again. Over the following weeks, I noticed changes in how the HOA operated. Deborah sent out a community survey asking for feedback on existing rules and suggestions for improvement. Violation notices decreased dramatically. She started a community newsletter that focused on positive things happening in the neighborhood rather than just enforcement actions. The board meetings became less contentious, more collaborative. Rick told me that Deborah had personally apologized to several homeowners for previous overly strict enforcement. She was clearly making an effort to repair her reputation and change her approach. I had to give her credit for that. It would have been easier to double down and become even more rigid, but instead she chose growth and humility. In December, about a month after the propane tank rule was revoked, I was putting up Christmas lights when Deborah drove by and stopped in front of my house. She rolled down her window. "Those look nice," she called out. "Very festive." "Thanks," I said, surprised by the compliment. "Just trying to add some holiday cheer." "I wanted to let you know that the board is working on a complete review of all our covenant restrictions," she said. "We are forming a committee of homeowners to provide input. Would you be interested in serving on it?" I climbed down from my ladder and walked over to her car. "You want me on a committee? You have shown good judgment and a willingness to speak up when things are not right," she said. "Those are exactly the qualities we need. Plus, you seem to have a good sense of what is reasonable versus what is excessive. I think you could help us find the right balance." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay as far away from HOA politics as possible. But another part recognized that this was an opportunity to help shape the community in a positive way. If I declined and the committee ended up implementing more restrictive rules, I would have no one to blame but myself for not participating. "Okay," I said. "I will do it. When do we start?" "First meeting is in January," she said. "I will send you the details. Thank you, Keith." "I really do appreciate it." She drove off, and I went back to hanging my lights, thinking about how strange life could be. 3 months ago, Deborah and I were locked in conflict over propane tanks. Now I was serving on an HOA committee at her invitation. Sometimes circumstances forced people to change, to see things from different perspectives. The snowstorm and her furnace failure had been that catalyst for Deborah, stripping away her authority and forcing her to experience the receiving end of her own strict rules. Christmas came and went, and the new year arrived. In mid-January, I attended my first Covenant Review Committee meeting. It was held in Deborah's living room, which surprised me until I realized she was trying to make it feel less formal and more collaborative. Besides me, the committee included Rick, 2 other homeowners named Jennifer and Tom, and Deborah herself. We spent 3 hours going through the existing covenants line by line, discussing what made sense and what needed revision. It was actually productive. Rick pushed back against restrictions on vehicle parking. Jennifer advocated for more flexibility on fence heights and materials. Tom, who was an attorney, helped us understand which rules had legal backing and which were just preferential. I found myself enjoying the process, the feeling of working together to make things better rather than fighting against arbitrary authority. By March, we had drafted a new set of covenants that streamlined the restrictions, eliminated petty rules, and focused on genuinely important issues like property maintenance, noise ordinances, and safety standards. We presented it to the full board, which approved it unanimously. Then we held a community vote, and it passed with an overwhelming majority. The new covenants explicitly allowed propane tanks to be stored on residential property, provided they met safety codes. They also relaxed rules on outdoor decorations, parking, fence styles, and a dozen other things that the old regime had micromanaged. It felt like the neighborhood could finally breathe, no longer under constant surveillance and threat of violation notices. In April, I was grilling steaks in my backyard, my propane tank sitting visibly and legally against the side of my house, when Rick came over with a six-pack of beer. "Smells good," he said, handing me a bottle. "Thanks for bringing these," I said, accepting the beer. "Steak will be ready in about 10 minutes. We stood around the grill enjoying the spring evening. The snow was gone, replaced by green grass and blooming flowers. The neighborhood looked alive and vibrant. "You know, I have been thinking about the whole propane tank saga," Rick said. "It is funny how something so small became such a big deal." "It was never really about propane tanks," I said. "It was about power and control versus freedom and reasonableness. The tanks were just the symbol." "Deep thoughts for a backyard barbecue," Rick joked, but I could tell he understood what I meant. "I am just glad it worked out," I said. "And I am glad Deborah was willing to change. Not everyone would have done that." "True," Rick agreed. "She stopped by my house last week to personally deliver the new covenant documents. We actually had a nice conversation. She told me she had been getting therapy to work on her control issues. Said the whole HOA president thing had become an unhealthy obsession for her." "Good for her," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Self-awareness is hard." The steaks finished cooking, and Rick and I sat on my deck eating and talking about everything except HOA rules. It was exactly what a spring evening should be: relaxed, friendly, uncomplicated. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, I went to my garage and grabbed a propane patio heater, wheeling it out to extend our time outside. Rick laughed when he saw it. "More propane," he said. "You are really rubbing it in now." "Just exercising my rights," I said with a grin. The rest of the year passed peacefully. The HOA continued to function under its new, more reasonable guidelines. Deborah remained president, but governed with a much lighter touch. Violation notices became rare, issued only for genuine problems like seriously neglected properties or safety hazards. The neighborhood felt less like a police state and more like a community. I continued serving on the Covenant Review Committee, which met quarterly to address any issues that arose. It was never a huge time commitment, but it gave me a voice in how the neighborhood was run and ensured that we did not slip back into the old ways of excessive control. One evening in November, almost exactly a year after the snowstorm that had changed everything, I was in my garage working on a bookshelf when Deborah knocked on my open garage door. "Keith, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Sure, come in," I said, setting down my sander. "What is up?" "I wanted to tell you that I am stepping down as HOA president," she said. "My term is up in January and I am not running for re-election." "Really? Why not?" I asked, surprised. "It is time," she said simply. "I have been doing this for 3 years and I think I have taken it as far as I can. The board needs fresh perspective, someone who is not carrying the baggage of the old regime. Also, frankly, I need a break. Being HOA president was consuming my life, and I want to focus on other things." "That is probably healthy," I said. "Do you know who is running?" "Gerald is considering it," she said. "And Patricia might throw her hat in. Both would be good choices, I think, steady, reasonable people." "What will you do with all your free time?" I asked. She laughed. "I have been asking myself that. Maybe take up a hobby, travel more. Stop obsessing about whether someone's grass is a quarter-inch too long." "Sounds like a good plan," I said. "I also wanted to thank you," she said, her tone becoming more serious, "for calling me out when I needed it. For selling me that propane tank when you could have justifiably told me to go to hell. For serving on the committee and helping fix the mess I created. You did not have to do any of that, but you did, and it made a real difference. You did the hard part," I said. "You changed." "That is not easy, especially in a leadership position where everyone is watching." "It was necessary," she said. I did not like the person I was becoming, and I did not like what the HOA was becoming under my leadership. Sometimes you need a wake-up call, and mine happened to involve freezing in my house during a blizzard while the person I had been harassing saved me with the exact item I had banned him from storing. The universe has a sense of irony. That it does, I agreed. We talked for a few more minutes, then Deborah left. I went back to my woodworking, thinking about growth and change and the unexpected ways life teaches us lessons. The bookshelf I was building was coming together nicely, each piece fitting where it belonged, creating something functional and beautiful. It seemed like a good metaphor for what had happened in the neighborhood over the past year. January came, and Gerald was elected as the new HOA president. His first official act was to formally thank Deborah for her service and acknowledge the improvements she had made in her final year. It was a classy move, recognizing both her mistakes and her efforts to correct them. Deborah attended the meeting but sat in the audience rather than at the board table, looking relaxed in a way I had never seen before. Life continued in Pinewood Hills. The HOA functioned smoothly under Gerald's leadership, handling necessary business without becoming overbearing. My propane tanks remained where I wanted them. My garage workshop stayed organized, and I grilled regularly throughout the year without any bureaucratic hassles. Sometimes I would see Deborah around the neighborhood, usually walking her dog or working in her garden. We would wave and exchange pleasantries. Our relationship transformed from adversarial to cordial. She seemed happier, less stressed, more at peace with herself and the world. One warm summer evening, I was having a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard. Rick was there, along with several other neighbors including Jennifer and Tom from the Covenant Committee. Deborah walked by on the sidewalk with her dog and I called out to her, "Deborah, want to join us? We have plenty of food." She hesitated, then smiled. "Sure, why not? Let me take Bailey home and I will be right back." 20 minutes later, she returned and integrated seamlessly into the gathering. We ate burgers and drank beer and talked about everything from local politics to the best hiking trails in Colorado. At one point, someone made a joke about HOA rules, and instead of getting defensive, Deborah laughed along with everyone else. "I deserve that," she said. "I was pretty insufferable for a while there." "Past tense noted and appreciated," Rick said, raising his beer bottle in a mock toast. As the evening wound down and guests started heading home, Deborah helped me clean up. We gathered paper plates and empty bottles, working in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "You know what is funny?" she said as we bagged the trash. "A year ago, I never would have been invited to something like this. People tolerated me because I was HOA president, but nobody actually wanted me around. Now, I feel like I am actually part of the community instead of just policing it." "That is because you are being a person instead of a position," I said. "People respond to authenticity." "Therapy taught me that," she said, along with a lot of other things about control and anxiety and why I felt the need to micromanage everyone around me. Turns out trying to control external circumstances is what you do when you feel like your internal life is chaotic. "Who knew?" "Sounds like good therapy," I said. "It was," she agreed. "Still is, actually. I am still going every other week. Working on myself is an ongoing project." We finished cleaning up and Deborah headed home. I stood in my backyard, looking at my house and my neighborhood, feeling genuinely content. The propane tank saga seemed like ancient history now, a bizarre conflict that had somehow led to positive change. It had exposed problems, forced conversations, and ultimately made the community stronger. My propane tank sat against the side of my house, visible and completely unremarkable. They were just tools, equipment for outdoor cooking, nothing more. But for a while, they had been symbols of a larger struggle about autonomy and authority, about the right to live peacefully without unnecessary interference, about finding balance between community standards and individual freedom. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year and a half, from Deborah's initial violation notice to her appearance at my door during the snowstorm, to the covenant reforms to tonight's neighborhood barbecue. It was a reminder that people can change, that conflicts can lead to understanding, and that sometimes the universe arranges circumstances in ways that teach us exactly what we need to learn. The summer night was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of someone else's grill from down the street. I could hear laughter from a neighboring yard and the distant sound of kids playing. It was peaceful, uncomplicated, normal. This was what a neighborhood should feel like. A place where people lived their lives without drama, where rules existed to help rather than hinder, where differences could be resolved through conversation rather than confrontation. I went inside and made myself a final beer before bed, standing at my kitchen window and looking out at the quiet street. Deborah's house was 2 blocks away, invisible from here, but no longer a source of stress or conflict. Gerald's house was around the corner, occupied by a reasonable man who understood that leadership meant service, not control. Rick's house was 3 doors down, home to a good friend and ally who had stood by me when things were difficult. This was my community, imperfect but functional, filled with regular people trying to live their lives. The HOA served its purpose now without overreaching, maintaining genuine standards without imposing arbitrary restrictions. It had taken a crisis, a confrontation, and a lot of hard work to get here, but it was worth it. I finished my beer and headed to bed, satisfied with how things had turned out. The propane tanks would still be there in the morning, sitting against my house, requiring no explanation or justification. They were mine to use as I saw fit, and nobody was going to fine me for it. That simple freedom, so easily taken for granted, had been fought for and won. And in winning that small battle, we had transformed something larger: the nature of authority in our community and the relationship between individual rights and collective rules. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are the quiet ones, the everyday freedoms that let you live your life without unnecessary interference. My propane tanks represented that victory, and every time I saw them, I was reminded of what we had accomplished together. Not just changing a rule, but changing a culture, proving that communities work best when they value reason over rigidity, when they listen to their members instead of dictating to them, when they remember that rules should serve people, not the other way around. That lesson, learned through conflict and cold weather and ultimately cooperation, was worth more than any propane tank. It was the foundation of a better neighborhood, a healthier community, and a reminder that even the most intractable problems can be solved when people are willing to talk, listen, and sometimes admit they were wrong. I fell asleep that night thinking about how far we had all come and grateful for the strange journey that had brought us here. Tomorrow I would wake up, go to work, and live my life in peace. And if I wanted to grill burgers, my propane tanks would be right there, ready and waiting, completely visible and completely legal. It was a small thing, but it meant everything.